are under significant threat. There are quite a number of fraudulent cases which are a significant factor in the rising costs of insurance and in the culture of claim at any cost. The Irish Independent recently, in an undercover investigation, have also reported that some GPs and some solicitors are contributing to this culture of fraudulent claims and exaggerated claims by amending and holding back vital information in terms of medical reports and some sort of interaction between elements within both professions. I think in that context, Taoiseach, it's fair to say that the government's response to date, if you go back over the last 3 years and all the various commissions that have been established, has been one of considerable inertia, delay after delay, and a lack of urgency in grappling with the essentials of this crisis. Now, I do welcome the intention of the government and the introduction to the government to support Senator Padraig O'Cadig's legislation, the Perjury Bill, which has been supported by our own colleague Deputy Troy and the Fianna Fáil party from the outset. And I think that is something that we will help to fast-track through the Dáil. But I would also point out to the Taoiseach that last year, as far back as I think October 2018, Billy Kelleher had tabled legislation, the Civil Liability in Courts Amendment Bill, which would have mandated the courts to refer to the DPP fraudulent claims and actions which would have been dismissed as fraudulent by the courts, so that fraudsters would face the full rigours of the law. Now, we've been waiting and waiting for a response from the Minister for Justice in relation to that legislation. And I have the letters, Ministers nodding, I have the letters. 8 months ago, the Minister indicated that he would deal with this within a month and had not been dealt with. Deputy Michael McGrath also introduced legislation that again would have increased penalties in relation to those committing fraudulent claims, would have increased the penalties and I think would have added to the strength of our deterrence to people who would undertake such claims, particularly in terms of legal costs, that they would be obliged to pay the legal costs of such a fraudulent claim. Because at the moment, it's the holder of the insurance policy or the establishment or the enterprise that has to bear the full brunt of the legal costs in many of these cases. Deputy McGrath's bill is still at committee. Now, I welcome the fast-tracking of Senator O'Cadig's bill, but equally I would put it to you that Deputy Kelleher's bill should have been fast-tracked a long time ago, and so should Deputy McGrath. It's now over 12 months, Taoiseach, since the completion of the final report of the Personal Injuries Commission. Incredibly, it showed that I think we're 4.5 times higher than the soft tissue injuries. The level of damages for soft tissue injuries in Ireland is 4.5 times higher than that of our neighbours in England and in Wales. So, Taoiseach, will the government commit to fast-tracking Deputy Kelleher's legislation and Deputy McGrath's legislation, which would have an impact on those making fraudulent insurance claims? And when will the government establish a publicly funded anti-fraud unit in An Garda Síochána?
We've lost a minute. Taoiseach.
Thanks very much, Deputy, and I want to thank him for raising this important issue, which all of us in this House will know is of huge concern to the business sector, but not just businesses, also sports clubs, creches, community halls, all of whom are facing the cost of rising insurance premiums. And I think we all need to recognise insurance companies, the judiciary, others involved in the sector, that increasing insurance costs have a consequence. They can cause businesses to close, they can cause people to lose their jobs, and these are things that none of us want to see happen. I do think in the broader area of insurance we have made some good progress in recent years. On motor insurance, for example, we've seen that fall from its peak in 2016 by maybe 20 or 30%. Health insurance, which had been rising rapidly every year, has now levelled off for the last few years, and the same goes for home insurance. When it comes to public liability, we've much work yet to do. And I also want to join with the Deputy in complimenting the Independent Newspaper Group on the investigation that they carried out in relation to the nexus that exists between some elements of the legal profession and some elements of the medical profession when it comes to exaggerating claims and altering claims. And I think that was a very timely investigation and is something that we all need to pay a lot of attention to because there is a profit motive there, unfortunately, and elements of both professions make a lot of money out of these claims. In terms of government action, as the Deputy acknowledged, we're pressing ahead with the perjury bill, which is being piloted by Senator Okeda and others, and that will strengthen our perjury laws around those who make fraudulent and exaggerated claims. In addition to that, the Judicial Council has a committee now which is going to be set up, and that committee, led by judges, is going to examine the quantum of personal injury claims. They're independent. It's important to allow them to do their work independently, but as the Deputy points out, it is the case that in Ireland the payouts for personal injuries are 4 and 5 times what they are in other jurisdictions. And as we all know, about 90% of people, once they receive a payment, no longer need to attend treatment for their whiplash. It seems that the cure for whiplash is a compensation payment in Ireland, not any medical treatment. Also, there is legislation being brought through by Deputy Doherty and Deputy Pearse Doherty, and Cabinet just approved this morning 2 amendments he's proposed to that legislation. We're going to bring that through, and that will result in greater transparency around insurance costs. So there are those 3 things that are happening: Okeda's bill on perjury, Doherty's bill on transparency, and also the most important reform is the Judicial Council setting up its independent committee to review the quantum of awards paid to people who suffer injuries in Ireland. And we'd expect, if they go down, that the industry, the insurance industry itself, which is very profitable in Ireland, notwithstanding everything else, should respond with lower premiums. I'll have to come back to you about Deputy Kelleher's bill and Deputy McGrath's bill. I'll take a look at them, come back to you during the week as to whether they can be progressed and find exactly what the reasons are as to why they haven't.
My
understanding is Deputy Flanagan was meant to come back to us 8 months ago. There's been letters written to him by former Deputy Kelleher. Otherwise, and I got your response, which you said you'd respond within a month, and I think that was, forgive me, it might have been 8 months ago when you were going to respond within the month. But I think, Taoiseach, there is no data in terms of public liability insurance claims. And in fact, much of the Personal Insurance Commission's recommendations have yet to be implemented. You talked about, for example, health insurance levelling off. Now, there's a terrible air of detachment about that comment, Taoiseach, because most people out there are frightened by the level of health insurance, are desperate about it. It's a huge impact on people's incomes, and elderly people in particular who cling to their health insurance wouldn't really it wouldn't resonate with them, the phrase that your costs are levelling off in terms of health insurance. Motor insurance is up 32% over 2014. Ask young drivers, ask returning immigrants, for example, who have huge issues with it, or indeed older drivers as well in certain instances. And the real issue, Taoiseach, is the delay. You talked about the Judicial Council bill. I mean, how long ago was it since that was recommended? I mean, this is a crisis. Is there a timeline? Is there a timeline, for example, for the Judicial Council to report? I don't believe there is.
Taoiseach to respond.
And you might indicate to me what is the timeline for the Judicial Council to report. But when we meet the various groups out there who are paying the insurance, they're desperate about this. You take Killinarden Community Facility and Centre, for example. They may have to close facilities now because they simply can't afford the 30% hike in the premium that they're facing. And it's all over the country. Yet this is going on year after year after year, and it's a very delayed and seemingly ineffective response.
Thanks, Deputy. The Judicial Council bill only became law in the last couple of months. It's only when the Oireachtas passes legislation that it becomes law and is signed by the President. And even though it only became law in the last couple of months, in fact only the past couple of weeks, it has become possible for the Chief Justice to establish the committee. The Chief Justice is doing that. The judiciary, as you know, guard their independence fiercely, and they're right to do so, and it's not for us in this House to set a timeline for their work. But I would ask that they do it as expeditiously as possible, and perhaps the Chairman of the committee or the Chief Justice himself can inform us as to what timeline they think they can meet. In terms of the Garda response, there was a recommendation that there be a dedicated bureau established to deal specifically with the issue of insurance fraud. The Garda Commissioner has decided in his wisdom, and it is his decision, I agree with this, that rather than having a dedicated national bureau just dealing with insurance fraud, that this is best done at divisional and local level and through the National Economic Crime Bureau. So it is being done. It's just being done in the way that the Garda Commissioner thinks is best.
Corlett.
Today, the Society of St Vincent de Paul launched Growing Up in the Cold. The report exposes the grim reality of thousands of families living in energy poverty. 1 in 6 households are spending more than 10% of their income on heating and electricity. Older people and lone parents are particularly affected. Significantly, the report highlights that 42% of children living in the private rental sector experience energy poverty, and 36% of children living in social housing have the same difficulties. The report clearly shows a relationship between poor quality accommodation and energy poverty. The report says that 140,000 children are living in homes with leaks, with damp and with rot. And one parent quoted in the report said, "There are 6 of us with 2 bedrooms, living room, kitchen and bathroom. We have 1 small heater and we move it from room to room." 1 small heater, Taoiseach, that is a clear breach of minimum standards. Now, 2 years ago, this House passed a Sinn Féin private member's motion on standards in the private rental sector. It called for an NCT-style certification system for private rented housing, for adequate resourcing for local authorities to ensure meaningful inspection and enforcement, and a review of penalties for non-compliant landlords. 2 years on, Taoiseach, and what has changed? Last year, just 9% of private rental properties were inspected. Of these, 82% failed to meet minimum standards, and less than half of these had their breaches resolved by year's end. Taoiseach, this simply is not good enough. Your failure to resource the enforcement of minimum standards is literally leaving tens of thousands of people, including thousands of children, living in the cold. And your failure to properly fund the maintenance of councils' housing is leaving thousands of the state's tenants in unacceptable conditions. So, Taoiseach, in light of the depressing findings in today's report, will you fully implement the proposals from the 2017 Sinn Féin private member's motion that was passed without opposition in this House? And will you actively consider implementing the 7 recommendations in the St Vincent de Paul report published this morning?
Thanks, Deputy. The Deputy has given me the courtesy of giving me a very direct question. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to read that report yet, so I'd have to take a look at it before I could tell you which recommendations we can and cannot implement. But I do want to acknowledge that a lot of people in Ireland experience energy poverty, or fuel poverty, if you prefer to use that term, and that's particularly relevant at this time of the year, during the winter, as days get darker and colder. And we're all aware that quite a considerable number of people every year across the Western world, including Ireland, die as a result of cold-related illnesses. What are we doing about it? 4 main things. First of all, the fuel allowance goes up. It goes up again in January in a few weeks' time. We're investing in retrofitting social housing to make sure that we improve the quality of that housing and make those homes warmer. New building standards mean that pretty much all new buildings and new homes are near zero energy buildings. We have a warmer home scheme that people can apply for to assist them in retrofitting their homes and making them warmer. And also local authorities have a role to play. And I know that many parties opposite are now in controlling positions in local authorities and can choose to reduce or increase the property tax, can choose to reduce or increase commercial rates. And they also need to be held accountable for their decisions where they choose to reduce the property tax instead of investing, for example, in housing and other services, or perhaps choose whitewater rafting as a priority when they get control of local authorities over other issues. I think it would be remiss of the House, though, not to acknowledge the significant progress that has been made in recent years in reducing poverty. And notwithstanding the very many individual stories of people suffering and families in distress, we know from the CSO, from figures they produced just last week, the Survey on Income and Living Conditions, that poverty in Ireland has fallen now for 5 years in a row. It's at its lowest now in a very long time. Deprivation rates are falling, and also income inequality in Ireland is at its 2nd lowest since records began. And that is a considerable achievement, and perhaps doesn't always come across when we tend to focus on hard cases, however real they may be. We're seeing huge progress made in Ireland in terms of reducing poverty, child poverty, deprivation in recent years, and that didn't happen by accident. It happened because we have jobs, because the economy is being well managed, people have jobs to go to, because incomes are rising, because the minimum wage has been increased, because pay is increasing, and take-home pay is increasing too because of reductions in tax and increases in social welfare. And those will continue so long as we manage the economy well and so long as we manage the public finances well too.
Supplementary question.
Thank you, Last Count Caller. The great difficulty, Taoiseach, of course, is in your two-tier economic recovery, increasing numbers of people are being left very far behind. So, yes, we have the fuel allowance, but it's nowhere close to the rising costs of fuel. Yes, we have retrofitting of local authority stock, but it's 2 to 3 years of a wait before you can get your windows or doors replaced. And yes, we do have new standards for building, but they are very much in question when local authorities are not being funded by the government to adequately inspect private rental tenancies. And yes, local authorities do have a role, but let's not forget, thanks to your government and indeed Fianna Fáil before them, local authorities lost 25% of their staff during the recession, the single greatest loss of staff in any sector of the public service. So what I ask you to do, Taoiseach, is study the report from St Vincent de Paul very, very carefully. Study its 7 recommendations and come back to this House and tell us which of them you believe should be implemented. But what I'd also ask you to do is respect the democratic decision of this House of November 2 years ago and fully implement the recommendations of the Sinn Féin private members' motion to ensure that all private rental properties are fully inspected and all minimum standards are fully adhered to, so that no child is living in energy poverty because of the failure of your government to fund adequate enforcement and inspection of properties in the private rental sector or the local government sector.
Thanks, Deputy. I've immense respect for St Vincent de Paul as an organisation. I will take a look at the report and the Government will issue a reasoned response to it as soon as we have a chance to consider it. On the wider issue, Deputy, everyone is entitled to their own opinions, but they're not entitled to their own facts. If we had a two-tier economic recovery in Ireland, we wouldn't see income inequality at its lowest, or its second lowest since records began in 2004. We wouldn't see consistent poverty falling dramatically as it has in recent years. We wouldn't see deprivation going down. We wouldn't see 40,000 children lifted out of child poverty in recent years. Yes, things vary from region to region, and of course the experience is not the same for every family. But broadly, the experience in Ireland is one of us going in the right direction. Unemployment down, incomes rising, poverty and deprivation falling. Those are the facts, and no amount of politics or populism or spin can cover up for that. In terms of inspections, the new rent bill this year gives new powers to the Residential Tenancies Board. There are additional inspectors, and the first cases are now underway. By 2021, it's anticipated that 1 in 4 properties will be inspected, so roughly every property getting inspected every 4 years. And money is being provided for this from central government, but it will be helpful that those parties that control local authorities now that could help to contribute to the cost of that should do so, rather than cutting the LPT or investing in whitewater rafting.
And Chuck the Breed Smith, 3 Bumage.
Last Count Caller, since you haven't read the report from the Vince de Paul, let me read something from it. Light, heat and power are fundamental requirements to participate in society and a prerequisite for social inclusion. Last year, the Vincent de Paul spent more than $5 million helping people with the cost of energy, in an increase of 20% on the previous year. We are concerned about the current and future impact of energy price increases on households we are assisting, the majority of whom are families with children. Vincent de Paul are meeting more and more families forced to put up with substandard accommodation, with issues like damp and mould commonplace. Members are particularly worried about the risk of poor health for children living in those conditions for long periods of time. A household is considered to be in energy poverty if it is unable to attain an acceptable standard of warmth and energy services in the home at an affordable cost. Some of the stark figures: households with children are more than twice as likely to be in arrears with utility bills than households without children. 140,000 children are living in homes that have issues with leaks, damp and rot. 31% of lone parents are spending more than 10% of their income on energy, and 1 in 7 lone parents are in severe poverty. Now, a couple of issues I'd like to raise beyond that raised by Deputy O'Brien is the question of the fuel allowance. It was increased to a very generous €5, I am joking, in this budget, and it is clear that that will go nowhere near meeting the same time increases in the carbon taxes that were brought in the same budget. We also have the fact that not all of the poorest children who rely on social welfare are in receipt of fuel allowance. And as a member of the Climate Action Committee, I pursued and won the support of this House for a fuel poverty study to be carried out prior to the carbon taxes being increased. The Minister and your government failed to do that, and so we have today to revisit the question of fuel poverty among 140,000 children. Taoiseach, 140,000 children who will be waiting for Santa Claus in the freezing cold, who the report says will huddle together in one room in an attempt by their parents to heat those rooms rather than having them separated throughout the house. And I want to highlight 3 areas of your failure. One is the housing policy and the over-reliance on the private sector. A private landlord can apply for grants to retrofit and to secure a home with insulation. A tenant cannot do that. Another is the blind insistence on increasing the carbon tax for everybody, regardless of their situation. And the third is the lack of ambition shown by this government in its policies on retrofitting. You are leaving people in the private rental sector completely vulnerable, and people who are council tenants. Council budgets this year have no budget for retrofitting homes, and the SEAI are totally inadequately funded to do the job that's required.
Thanks, Deputy. I'm not sure I can add much to the response that I gave earlier, but just to reiterate, the fuel allowance, or the energy allowance as it's going to be called, does increase in January, and that will help people with their fuel costs and their energy costs. The child dependent allowance goes up too, which will help the poorest families who have children with bills in general. We are retrofitting social housing, and indeed one of the policy decisions we made in the budget was to ring-fence any additional funding that's coming in from an increase in the carbon tax for climate action and just transition. So we're using the proceeds of that carbon tax increase in order to pay for more retrofitting of social housing, in order to increase the fuel allowance. And also we're building more social housing. About 11,000 homes will be added to the social housing stock next year, 10,000 this year. And those homes, 3/4 of them new builds, are built to the highest standard and are warm homes. And I've been in many of those homes and seen how nice and how comfortable they are. And they're a huge improvement on the very old social housing stock that we have around the country that absolutely needs to be upgraded, but can only be done year by year, bit by bit. The fuel allowance goes up to €24 a week, not €5 a week. And for those who are in receipt of the fuel allowance, it will actually compensate them and some when it comes to the carbon tax. I do appreciate there are some people that don't receive the fuel allowance, but for the worst off, the lowest paid or lowest income quartile in society, most do, and the costs of the carbon tax increases about 40-something euros per household, but the fuel allowance increases 50-something, so it actually more than compensates those in receipt of fuel allowance. I appreciate it varies from household to household and people have different heating systems, but that is the case generally speaking. The Deputy mentioned that the carbon tax applies to everyone, and I do wonder if she understands how carbon tax works. It's not possible to apply carbon tax to some people and not others. The whole point of a behavioural tax like carbon tax, just like the tax we have on cigarettes, just like the tax that we have on alcohol, is that it does apply to everyone. And the more carbon you produce, the more you pay. It applies to businesses as well, by the way. In fact, most of the carbon tax is paid for by businesses.
For supplementary, Deputy.
I just want to repeat, Taoiseach, unless you're calling the Vincent de Paul some kind of fairy tale story, the report that they've issued this morning, I just want to repeat, 140,000 children are cold this winter, in the weeks leading up to Christmas. How does that make you feel? It makes me feel absolutely appalled. And I want to relocate where I believe the problem is. When you increase carbon tax and you say it's there to change behaviour, you don't allow people to change the behaviour. People living in private rental accommodation cannot apply for SEAI grants, and there's no compunction on landlords in this country to have the homes up to standard. People living in council homes cannot apply for SEAI grants. The council must intervene, and retrofit their homes. So you are penalising the most vulnerable and the poorest. I won't repeat the stats I read out at the beginning, but I want to point out another huge anomaly. Many people who move into council tenancy or buy their own homes are forced to go on prepay power. And a company known as Prepay Power have just released figures in November that they have received a dividend in this country of 17.2 million. That is outrageous when people are forced to use these cards, and yet we have the highest rate of energy arrears in the whole of Europe. There is something desperately wrong here. And when you have a company making vast profits and ordinary people have to suffer in this way without any returns back from that company to help alleviate the poverty and the cold that children are experiencing this winter, please don't deny that what the Vincent de Paul have reported this morning is untrue. It's absolutely true, and deal with the facts.
Thanks, Deputy. The fact that you feel the need to put words in my mouth and attribute remarks to me that I never made says to me that you're not interested in the facts. That's what it says to me. In relation to council housing, as I mentioned, we have a retrofitting programme underway. That is in part being funded by the proceeds that are coming in from the carbon tax. And we're building more social housing all the time. Social housing to the highest quality ever. About 10,000 additional social homes will be provided this year, more than any year in the past 20 years, through the boom and through the bust. It'll be up to 11,000 next year, 12,000 the year after. About 60,000 new homes will be added to the social housing stock over the next 5 years. Probably the biggest social housing programme that's happened in generations. And it's happening with homes being built with the highest quality and the best energy ratings.
Final questions from the Rural Independence Deputy Michael Hartley. 2 minutes.
Thank you, Lascan Curla. Taoiseach, my question concerns the number of children in emergency accommodation. Starting in October of this year at 3,826 as we approach Christmas 2019. I had proposed to ask this question to the Minister for Children and Youth Affairs, but the question was transferred this afternoon to the Minister for Housing for a reply at a later date. It was to be a priority question. So I'm going to ask you the question instead, Minister, and the question, or Taoiseach, and the question is, in July 2016, I suggested to you, Minister Zappone, in a Dáil question, that the spectre of 2,177 children housed in emergency accommodation was a blight on the nation. With projected figures of 4,026 children by this Christmas, you, as Minister, how do you respond to this appalling deterioration in figures? And of course, I'm asking you, Taoiseach, instead of Minister Zappone, who transferred the question. In a similar question I put to Minister Zappone in 2016, she replied that the Action Plan for Housing and Homelessness, which had just been published, had an ambition that within 1 year we would not be reliant on emergency accommodation to house children and families. The Minister went on to outline the support services that would be put in place to support those children until mid-2017, when they would no longer be in emergency accommodation. Access to early year services, education, nutritional needs, TUSLA services and supports for pregnant women. She intended to move towards a sense of normality for those children. It was to be a political priority to avoid lasting damage to these children. Of course, Taoiseach, the fundamental solution to addressing child homelessness is to provide them with a home, not to rely on emergency accommodation, which was to be phased out by mid-2017, but has actually got worse. So instead of having 2,177 children who were homeless, we now have 3,826 and rising. When one considers that children move in and out of homelessness on a frequent basis, the figure is probably far greater than 3,826 who are affected. So my question to you, Taoiseach, is how do you respond to this appalling deterioration in child homelessness figures?
Taoiseach's 3 minutes to respond.
Thanks, Deputy. I think it's heartbreaking that so many children are living in emergency accommodation, particularly at this time of year, but at any time of year. And even as you say, they may go in and out of it quite quickly, maybe 6 months or a year in some cases. That's still far too long, and still far too many. I'm not sure where your projected figures come from. We know that in the most recent monthly figures, the number of families that are homeless and the number of children that are homeless fell slightly, and I hope that will continue in the next couple of months. Also, the number of rough sleepers is down. I remember the week when, across the road from here on Molesworth Street, John Corrie died in a doorway on Molesworth Street. At that time, there were about 168 rough sleepers in Dublin, and the most recent figures show now that figure's fallen to about 92. And many of those are people who need a lot of support, and it's very hard to get them in. But it does demonstrate some of the progress that has been made, that rough sleeping is now down to its lowest level in about 5 years. But this is certainly a problem that is a real blight on our society, as you describe it. I think when we talk about the fact that there are 10,000 people living in emergency accommodation, we shouldn't forget that 14,000 people have actually been brought out of emergency accommodation, have been housed by the government and are now in secure accommodation. So it isn't the same 10,000 all the time. In fact, more people have been taken out of homelessness into secure housing now than are actually homeless. But unfortunately, people continue to become homeless every day and every week. You asked how we respond, really in two ways. In 2020, provided in the budget in 2020, which you didn't vote for, is €160 million in funding for the charities and agencies that work with us, both to prevent people becoming homeless in the first place. About half of people are now prevented from becoming homeless in the first place, but also to help them through emergency accommodation, to run the family hubs, and to then get out of emergency accommodation. That's not something you supported or voted for. Secondly, is stepping up our investment in social housing. 3 or 4 years ago, when this government, 3 years ago when this government came to office, I think maybe 3,000 or 4,000 houses were being added to the social housing stock every year. That's up to 10 this year. It'll be 11 next year, 12 the year after that. Not in any year this century have more houses been added to the social housing stock than this year, and we'll do better again next year and better again the year after. But as the Central Bank pointed out today, we're catching up on a massive deficit. A country like Ireland, with our population and our demographics, should be adding about 35,000 houses to its housing stock every year, and we're not there yet. We've trebled the amount of supply, up from about 7,000 a year 3.5 years ago to over 20,000 now. We'll get to 25 next year. We will get up to 35. If we could do it quicker, if there was a cheque I could sign, if there was a button I could press, if there was a lever I could pull, we'd have done it by now. But our housing market was destroyed, our construction industry was destroyed, our banks were bust and our government was bust. And we had a 7-year period when almost no homes were built in Ireland. During that period, 200,000 homes should have been built, and it is going to take us, and no matter what anyone may say, it is going to take us many years to recover from that.
Deputy Harty has 1 minute for a supplementary question.
Thank you very much, Taoiseach. And as I said at the outset, my question was about children and child homelessness. And the Royal College of Physicians have produced a report, The Impact of Homelessness and Inadequate Housing on Children's Health. And that was the reason I was addressing my question to Minister Zappone, the Minister for Children and Youth Affairs, not to the Minister for Housing, but it was transferred. I have no control over that. But it was specifically about child homelessness and the impact that that has on their health. It causes serious mental and physical illness to children who are in persistent homelessness. 25% are at an increased risk of physical and mental health. Higher risk of preterm pregnancies in women who are pregnant in homeless accommodation. Higher rates of asthma, respiratory illness and infectious diseases. Poor nutrition. Less access to development opportunities. Play and recreational and social activities. They're more likely to be bullied. And these effects on children's health go way beyond their childhood and go into their adult lives. And Taoiseach, these children are our future. And your response failed to address any of the issues I've raised. And you failed to explain how in 2017 we were not going to rely on emergency accommodation to house children, yet the figures have almost doubled in the lifetime of this government.
Taoiseach has 1 minute to respond.
Thanks, Deputy. I think I may be correct in saying that when this government came to office, or certainly when the current minister came to office, the number of people in emergency accommodation was about 8,000. It's now 10. I don't think that's quite a doubling, but it has got worse, and there's no denying that. despite our best efforts. In terms of what we've been trying to do to alleviate the situation, the most important thing is preventing people becoming homeless in the first place. As I mentioned, because we fund and work with so many charities and so many NGOs, we're able to prevent about half of people becoming homeless in the first place. And that's a significant change from where we were a few years ago. We've also invested in the family hubs, precisely because we accept that hotel and B&B accommodation is inadequate, whereas family hubs are by no means perfect, but they are better. They give people dignity, their own door, their own cooking facilities, their own play areas, and I've been to visit them and I've seen them for myself. We know that people who spend time in family hubs get out of them into permanent housing much quicker than those who self-accommodate. But above all and beyond all that, the solution has to be more supply of social housing, so we can take people off the housing list and out of emergency accommodation, and also more supply of private housing, so that people have homes to buy, and most people want to buy their own home, and also more homes for people to rent, because lots of people will need to rent at some point in their life. And we need to get to the point where we're building about 35,000 new homes in Ireland every year, as the central bank said. We've trebled housing supply already, just under the term of this government of Fine Gael and Independent Alliance.
Please stop.
We need to do more, and we will do more.
Now I call on Matthew McGrath to announce the order of business as recommended by the Business Committee.
The business this week shall be as set out in the report of the Business Committee dated 5th December 19. In relation to today's business, it is proposed that the item 14, motion re-proposed approval by Dáil of the Universities Act 1997, section 54(3), University Authorisation Order 2019, back from committee. Item 15, motion re-proposed approval by Dáil of the Planning and Development Amendment Regulations 2019.